Well, hello there. It is nice to have you. I'm wondering, where Joe Biden has been. I'm sure a lot of you have been as well. It seems like Donald Trump is already acting as the president as he's actively involved in seemingly everyday decisions. But Joe Biden has been very active in one aspect, and his push to empower California, that one state on the far left side of the country, allowing California to mandate electric vehicles, raising all these constitutional, and not just for California, by the way, but for the entire country. He wants to follow Gavin Newsom's course for California for all the other 49 states in the United States. And it raises significant constitutional and economic concerns. In fact, the U.S. Supreme Court has now stepped in to review the matter, questioning whether a single state like California should wield such outsized influence and power over the nation's automotive and energy policies. And at issue is, California's authority under the Clean Air Act, which allows it to impose stringent vehicle emission standards, effectively setting national policy for states that choose to follow its lead. Like Gavin Newsom says, we need to phase out all internal combustion engine vehicles. That means gas cars by 2035. No more. And it might even be earlier his desire, I think, is 2030, but 2035 would be the end of it if Gavin Newsom were to get his way. So just keep that in mind. If Gavin Newsom decides to run for president, that's what he would do. He would turn the United States into California. A lot of people are like that. A lot of people are not either. And I'm going to get into this in depth with my guest today, Patrick Anderson of Anderson Economic Group, just a few minutes away. Also, just a reminder to chime in today, comment, ask questions in the comments section, and I'll get to those in a moment as well. And you can ask Patrick questions as well if you would like, and we'll pose that to him when he joins us here on Tom Jordan Live in a few moments. Also, a reminder, the best way that you can help Tom Jordan Live, simply subscribe to the podcast, click the notification bell, share the videos, share the content if you deem it worthy enough to do so, and even share it with your enemies and see what they have to say. We're trying to get the word out about some important issues and maybe change a few minds and hearts along the way. Okay, so there are some people out there who claim that if we don't mandate that no one buys gas vehicles by the 2030s, we, the United States, are going to turn into Cuba. Like the United States is going to die, essentially. We will be a relic, and all you gas guzzling, dirty SUV drivers will be to blame for this. This is what they've written in the New York Times, in saying that if we don't do what China is doing, China is going to take over. So we need to mandate that people drive and buy only battery electric vehicles by 2035. And it's against the Constitution. So we'll get into that. That's why the Supreme Court is going to weigh in on what Joe Biden has been trying to do for a long time. But there are still some out there who say we've got to do this because economically our lives as a country depend on it. Well, Patrick Anderson wrote a great piece combating that claim as well. The idea that America will collapse into irrelevance without EV subsidies, it seems absurd because, as my guest today has written about it, that despite billions in taxpayer dollars, electric cars barely crack 8% of the market, while gas-powered trucks and SUVs dominate, built proudly in states like Michigan and in Texas. So we'll get into that in just a bit. By the way, the guy's name is Thomas Friedman. He wrote this piece in the New York Times. Look it up. Hopefully you won't be deceived by what he wrote in there. But look it up and you can see how crazy this whole notion. I mean, the U.S. auto industry, it depends on, it thrives on innovation and competition. And if we're ready, if the innovation is there, then, maybe we'll make that transition. But it's not there yet when it comes to electric vehicles. Despite Pete Buttigieg's attempt to spend billions of dollars on EV chargers that I think we've got just a few, what is it, a dozen, maybe 8 or something like that around the country that have been built. Many of them are broken. I drove by another one in this city in which I live, and the only one there was out of order again. And so you can't charge your car, the very few chargers that exist, because many of them are broken. So you got automakers like Tesla, you got Ford, you got Toyota, They've proven they can lead in both the traditional and the EV markets. They're not waiting for government handouts to do it. You don't need subsidies to thrive and to innovate. So this guy Friedman claims the claim is just totally ignorant of the way the free market works and the innovation. And we're not going to be Cuba. I think that the notion that Cuba drives all these very, very old cars is somehow that's going to happen to us because we'll be irrelevant. And I don't think so. All right, so a couple takeaways from this whole argument. First and foremost, allowing California to dictate vehicle regulations for the entire country, it undermines the principles of state rights. Each state has the right to govern in ways that align with its unique economy and its unique culture and population needs. Letting California impose its vision on other states effectively diminishes state sovereignty. And it's turning federalism, which actually, despite what you might think about the name of federalism, it actually protects state rights. That was the purpose of federalism. And it turns it into this whole charade. Like, this isn't environmental leadership, it's regulatory imperialism. Second takeaway, prior to getting to Patrick Anderson, listen, Americans value their freedom to choose what's best for their families and lifestyles, including their vehicles. And by the way, this notion of freedom isn't selfish, which some people started to claim. Remember the COVID pandemic, there were a lot of pundits out there. Even I've heard some pastors who make the claim that, it is selfish to do what you're doing by trying to stand for your rights. No, actually, what we're doing is we're standing for your rights, every individual, not just mine, but not just my wife's and my children's, but my enemy's rights too, of individual liberties and freedoms to live in the pursuit of their own happiness, whatever that looks like. Now, we have our ideas of what will ultimately lead to a person's happiness and true joy, but everyone has the individual choice to do it how they see fit. And that's the idea behind individual freedom. And this whole idea that it's selfish to do that, you need to all come together as one large body of, indescribable individuals and just form a group, and everyone does the exact same thing as you're mandated to do. That's totalitarianism. That's authoritarianism. That's a dictatorship. That's communism. That's socialism. That's government intervention into individuals' lives. And the United States was founded to oppose that entire ideology of Karl Marx and what they seem to still believe, some of them do, that there is this ultimate utopia that we're all going to reach if we all do the exact same thing and live the exact same way and all earn the exact same income and do everything as you're told to do by what they believe to be the ultimate authority, the government. No, so this is part of that. And that's why it's so important to talk about this, because these mandates do infringe on individual citizens' rights to drive whatever car they want to car, so long as it's not hurting anybody else. So, and they say, well, it's killing the climate. No, it's not. It's killing the earth. No, it doesn't seem to be doing that, actually, despite what you may have heard. So by banning the sale of internal combustion engine cars and vehicles, California forces working class families to adopt electric vehicles that remain expensive and they're impractical in many areas. It's not about climate change, it's about coercion disguised as progress. And I'll add to that a larger third point to the end of that second point here. It's about control, not the environment. It's not about the climate, it's about control. California's push for an EV mandate isn't about fighting climate change. It's about controlling what Americans drive and how they live and what choices they have. If left unchecked, this kind of power and this approach will bleed into other areas of life. It often has already, where bureaucrats in Sacramento, California, or in Washington, D.C., decide what's best for everyone else. And this fight isn't just about cars. It's about preserving personal liberty. So that's the third point. I might add a fourth point too here to my 2 points. The economic fallout is totally being ignored. The mandate threatens millions of jobs tied to traditional automotive manufacturing and maintenance, and the ethanol industry is another example of this. It imposes steep costs on industries that fuel America's economic engine with no concrete plan to mitigate the fallout. Oh yeah, and it also gives China more power over the United States. And I would ask people to say, listen, if you're going to mandate these kinds of certain things, or if you're a supportive of one of your members of Congress or a state representative mandating these types of rules for which cars you can drive because they're telling you that it's going to save the earth, ask them by how much. Get details. Don't allow them to be incredibly vague about what it's actually going to do. Talk to them and say, listen, okay, so how is it going to save the climate? And they'll give you another vague answer. No, 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 but like what degree, if the entire country of the United States went 100% not only electric vehicle, but all renewable energies, like the whole zero carbon footprint type of thing, by what degree would the Earth's temperature be reduced? They will give you no answer. And they'll say probably something like, well, no one knows the answer to that. If no one knows the answer to that, because the reason why I know this is because I've asked these disingenuous members of Congress in other areas that very question, and not one of them, not one single individual could give me an answer. And they'll cite some, well, the science is clear that it will save the. No, it's not clear, actually. There are many scientists who say, actually, carbon dioxide is not a toxic gas. It's actually it depends. Our plant life depends on carbon dioxide. That's their oxygen, if you want to put it that way. So anyway, so ask questions and ask them to be very specific about it as well. It's very important to do that. When Patrick joins us here, we're going to talk to him a little bit about some other things because I want to ask him, about the notion that Thomas Friedman in the New York Times was saying that somehow it's if we don't go in with China on this, China is going to uh, supersede us in authority and power and their economic vitality. And so, if that's the case, how is it then if we do go all in on renewable energies, how is it that they're not going to gain more power over this? Because what we're actually doing is, EV production, what does it depend upon? It depends on all these minerals, things like cobalt and lithium, which are sourced from other countries, and China dominates that market. Now, a lot of it comes out of Taiwan as well, and that's one reason why China wants to go into Taiwan because of the economic strength and the control of all these, semiconductors and chip production in Taiwan. But actually, the opposite is true, in my opinion, of what the New York Times has written, that if we go all in on renewable energy, we are ceding power to China and to these other countries because we will depend more on all of these minerals that they're producing in these, by the way, using exploitative labor practices, slavery. You've heard of that, right? So that's how it's, when you think about cobalt, how is cobalt produced? It's not produced here. It's produced in these countries. I think the Congo is where cobalt mainly comes from, and they're using slave labor to produce it. The environmentalists don't like to talk a whole lot about that. And, the critics are arguing that without heavy subsidies, the United States risks falling behind China in EV development. Why? Well, I would say because no one wants them. Very few people want them. But there's Tesla. Tesla has thrived. And by the way, Tesla is not getting subsidies because they're not, union made vehicles. And Joe Biden didn't even want to speak to Elon Musk, who's leading the charge. No pun intended. Well, it kind of was. He's leading the charge on EV production in this country. But he's doing it as a private entity, a private enterprise, and depending on the market and making his cars so good that people want to drive them and buy them. And he's leading the way on EV chargers, and so much so that even the government had wanted to maybe, hey, let's try Elon's EV charger because actually they're pretty good. They're better than what we have been able to produce. So we don't need the heavy subsidies that they say that we need. And the whole notion that the United States could become the new Cuba if we don't mandate these subsidies and whatnot on electric vehicles and get rid of gas-powered vehicles overlooks the current dominance right now of the American-made cars in this country and really around the world as well. Trucks and SUVs in the global markets. It's an exaggeration, this argument is, The real issue is like making vehicles more affordable and reliable for everyday Americans. And I want to talk because here's a great example of how great private enterprise is without the need for government subsidies. Patrick Anderson wrote about this as well. And he brought up two of probably the most successful individuals in their respective industries. He brought up Taylor Swift and then he brought up Elon Musk. Taylor Swift and Elon Musk did not need subsidies to thrive and to succeed. What they needed was ingenuity and innovation and to understand the market out there and how they can tap into the market. What do people, for Taylor Swift's perspective, what do people want to hear, and how can I thrive, and how can I provide excellence in what they're desiring to such a degree that millions and millions of people will want to buy her product, which is her music, and then other things as well, I guess, whatever else she produces out there. Same with Elon Musk. How can I be so excellent in what I innovate and then what I produce and what I offer, thinking 5, 10, 15 years down the road to such a degree that people will want the product that I am innovating and producing for them. It's excellence. It's not government subsidies, completely unnecessary. And I think you could look at other industries as well. Look at Amazon. Amazon, they didn't depend on subsidies to succeed. Amazon, in fact, they don't need subsidies to build these various distribution centers in these various states. Michigan is one state that wants to give Amazon subsidies to attract them to come to Michigan. They're already attracted to come to Michigan in other states because people are buying stuff on Amazon. So they need to build these distribution centers anyway because they developed such a system. They've revolutionized the way people shop based on their innovation. Jeff Bezos, I'm not a big fan of the guy. But anyway, because of his innovation, he's produced products that are attractive to the greater society. And so the governments, they step in, they think, oh, we're gonna be the reason why private enterprise succeeds. No, you're not actually. You're kind of getting in the way, and you're over-regulating private industry. Uh, okay, so we're waiting on. I tell you what, as we're waiting on Patrick Anderson, I want to switch over to what happened yesterday with the Federal Reserve. I want to get to that in just a bit because we've been talking a lot about EVs and whatnot. But the Fed made a big decision. I sat in the afternoon watching what the Fed's decision was going to be made. They made the decision at 2 o'clock yesterday, and some people were kind of upset that the rate cut wasn't as big as they had hoped it would be. Jerome Powell went out to explain the reasons for that, and he basically said, "Listen, the economy is not doing as great as a lot of your government leaders are saying it is. Inflation is still a problem, so I'm not going to, do 50 basis points. I'm going to do 25 instead." And because, yeah, despite these reporters, and I'm going to play you a clip here of one of these reporters, the way he asked it in just a second here. But the Federal Reserve cut its benchmark interest rate by 25 basis points in December. And that was yesterday afternoon, marking its second consecutive cut of that size as inflation remains above target. Now, they haven't solved the issue yet. And I watched some of Jerome Powell's press conference yesterday explaining this, where reporters were already hinting to Jerome Powell in their questions that they really like him to blame Donald Trump for the lower than expected rate cut. Because suddenly the reporters are concerned about Donald Trump causing inflation. So, in just a bit, we're going to get into that whole issue about the rate cut and Jerome Powell in a bit with Jimmy Plasky with Executive Wealth Management. But first, I want to go to Patrick Anderson, who's with us now, to talk about what's happening with the Supreme Court and the California mandates that Joe Biden loves and wants to implement across the country. Thankfully, Joe Biden is leaving office. Let's bring in Patrick Anderson now with Executive Wealth Management. Patrick, it's good to see you. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
All right, Tom, great to see you.
Yeah, it's nice. So I want to get your take because I've written a couple of your pieces now in the past few days, and I want to get to the California,
Yeah.
dictate and mandate in a second. But I also want to talk about your critique of, I think his name is Thomas Friedman, what he wrote in the New York Times, basically saying that if we don't, as a government, mandate these subsidies to electric vehicles, we're going to turn into Cuba and we're going to be irrelevant. We're going to be a relic in this country. A lot of fear mongering
Yeah.
going on there. Is there any truth to his claim?
I mean, Tom Friedman is a terrific writer, and I have read him before, and he's informed me on to think about things. including ironically being late for a meeting. So sorry, Tom, for
Oh, it's
this
okay.
this morning, but the uh, this is an example of the what I'll call the extreme. We know better. We're in New York or Washington, and we can tell you what to do. The argument was, and he was making this from China, and he says the trains are great, and everybody says they're doing everything, and they're going to have robots everywhere. And he acknowledges that China's population is declining and they have problems, but he says, yeah, unless we in America continue to subsidize electric cars and autonomous vehicles, we will become the new Cuba. We'll become the place people come to see old cars. That's literally what he wrote. And he's quoting another New York Times person for that informed opinion. I think, Tom, this is not a good, let me say, prediction for the future. I guess I'm in the business of thinking about things, and you and I have been talking for a while. It seems like my track record's pretty good, but
Yeah.
you
Oh,
know,
it has been. In fact, I'll go back to, I think it was Proposal 1 in 2022, and the way you changed my thinking on some of these pieces, these constitutional amendments to think more, a little bit more deeply about some of these things. And you are absolutely right about a number of issues we've talked about over the years. This comparison to Cuba, I mean, the last I looked, I do not believe that Cuba has ever had a thriving automotive manufacturing industry in that country, much like the United States does right now. Am I wrong about that, or I'm on
I
the right
I mean
track?
maybe pre-Castro, but I mean what people think, what they people. There's many great things about Cuban people and Cuban culture, so I don't want to minimize that. But
Sure.
the
Yeah.
notion that the Cuban economy is a model for anyone is just, I mean, disgracefully bad if you're giving informed opinion. The reason why you can go to Cuba and see these old American cars are because they got communism. Now they can't produce cars, and their people can't afford to buy new ones, so they constantly fixing up the old American cars, which now gives us a lot of nice, pictures of 1950s and 1960s American cars that now have got all kinds of parts replaced. And I give the Cuban people tremendous credit for their ingenuity, but they're suffering under a state government, a state economy, and that's what happens. And ironically, you go to China, this masthead editorialist for the New York Times, and you're there with other New York Times columnists, and you say, look, the Chinese government is telling us the trains are great, and they are great. So therefore, let's become China. I mean, sorry, I'm scratching my head here.
Yeah.
No, I don't want to be China. I want to be the United States of America, the leading economy, the largest economy, and the one that produces great cars that people like to buy without taxpayer subsidies.
Yeah.
Well,
We have
unfortunately,
we
we're
have great
also,
we have great airplanes in this country. I mean, I don't understand the argument there, and it sounds like what he's arguing for, despite his claim that we don't want to be like Cuba. It sounds like he is arguing for government intervention, government mandate, this kind of state-run industries, which is what Cuba was doing under communism, and this seems like a step towards that. A slight step, but that's what he seems to be arguing for, and he wants the United States to be more like China, which is they're also a communist nation in a sense as well. So I'm not understanding the logic here. It seems like he's a smart guy. Tom Friedman is. So I wonder, does he truly believe this? I mean, do you think people really believe who understand economic policy truly believe that if we become more like China, we will thrive economically?
Tom, I've been around long enough where I've seen people think that we ought to just abandon what we're doing and become like Europe,
Hmm.
uh, abandon what we're doing and become like communist China, abandon what we're doing, become like planned economy somewhere, Cuba. And I have actually read people say that Cuba is a success story. It's
Hmm.
a terrible error to make, and something we think the Cuban people are suffering under communism. That's why so many energetic Cuban Americans are here, because they escaped Cuba. They came here for opportunity, and the idea that we should, adopt some planned economy that is ruining some of these governments and societies that have tried it is just ridiculous. So certainly, I mean, It's ridiculous, but it was a a major editorial from the New York Times from their masthead columnist.
Yeah,
And go on there now and you can read the whole thing. Maybe I missed something, Tom, but it
yeah,
sure sounded like,
yeah.
and I quoted it, unless
Yeah.
we continue to have big government subsidies for vehicles that right now people aren't buying, we're going to become the new Cuba.
Okay, let's talk about a state that seems to also want to be like China, and that would be the state of California. And Joe Biden seems to love California, as does Gretchen Whitmer, and Gavin Newsom's proposals out there that we should not be making internal combustion engine vehicles by the 2030s. So there's something called the CARB rule in California, which effectively mandates that the elimination of the internal combustion vehicle in the state of California by banning the sales of them in order to meet these EPA standards that are very, very strict. And a lot of states are choosing to become like California as well in those endeavors. But it seems now that the automotive industry has, for several years now, Joe Biden pushing this also, that the entire country should really follow the way California has been doing things, this single state giving them such regulatory authority over other states in this country. How does granting that state, California, that much authority affect the principles, in your view, of state rights, and how will it impact the average consumer if this is allowed to go through, if it's not pushed back by the Supreme Court?
You're raising the right question, which I've been raising for the last 2 years because this has been going on now for a while. Because of an obscure provision in the 1970 Clean Air Act, we have allowed California a limited authority to regulate smog producing elements because the argument at the time was California had already taken action. They were particularly vulnerable to smog, noxious oxide, and other things that were coming from car tailpipes then. And so we allowed them, with federal government approval, to have their own regulation on those. Well, what's happened now under the Obama administration, now under the Biden administration, is the federal government is allowing California to grab what was a 1970s regulation about a different set of pollutants and apply it to carbon dioxide.
Hmm.
Now, I might want to add, I'm waving my hands here. I hope you can see that on the radio. I
We
am
we can.
waving it through carbon dioxide. Every single one of us is breathing in carbon dioxide and out carbon dioxide. Our trees are issuing carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is not a threat to life, it's a part of life on the earth. And the claim here that carbon dioxide in and of itself is so dangerous that we need to allow California to ban internal combustion engine cars is ridiculous. But somehow this is being allowed, and the Supreme Court, fortunately, is going to review it. Although they did a kind of a head scratching, we're gonna review part of it. They made two decisions within 2 business days that kind of take 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But also, you have the incoming Trump administration, and they're not favorable at all to allowing California to be what the Supreme Court says was a junior varsity EPA regulating half the country. And I'm glad for that. And everyone working in the auto industry should be glad for that because California is our biggest state in terms of population. And if you add California, a bunch of these other states up, if this was enforced literally, you would have to shut down whole production lines here in the Midwest because you wouldn't be able to afford to build some of the cars and just sell them in, say, half the markets. It'd just be prohibitively expensive. So
All of this
jobs in Michigan, Ohio, elsewhere are at risk by letting California be on this adventure.
All of that too is based on this notion that we have to do this in order to save the climate, and that's what Governor Gavin Newsom is saying. That's his admitted reason and motivation for doing this and declaring the mandate like the beginning of the end for internal combustion engines, and he celebrates that as this climate victory. But I've asked a lot of politicians questions such as, okay, if we go 100% all in on this, how much of an impact will that have on the climate? Like, about what degree will the temperature be reduced? And nobody has an answer on that. Not one person can answer that seemingly basic question. And you raise what is such an important concept here. The fact of carbon dioxide is somehow a pollutant when we know it is not a pollutant. In fact, I grew up, my mom used to say, "Hey, Tommy, little Tommy, talk to the plants because that's good for them because you're breathing out carbon dioxide. And it's
Talk
very
to the
good for
plant.
it's very good for plant life. So we need carbon dioxide for the environment, essentially." And now we're being told, like we're forgetting all the obvious things that science and moms have told us throughout all the years. So do you think,
Well,
I mean,
Tom,
have we just been
now I
deluded?
know. If I ever want to be a host like you, I need to talk to plants. I missed that. I missed that. I'm telling you,
Right, I talk
my
to plants.
whole
That's who I
my whole
practice. I just
plant
talk to my
curriculum is
plants.
deficient.
I have very large trees in my living room. Somehow they just keep growing
Right.
and growing. Oh my,
I will say I have a good relationship with many pine trees and oaks too. I'm kind of partial to oaks and hickories. Yeah.
I'm with you. I'm with you on that. But they do need carbon dioxide, and I think what
Yeah.
might end up happening is our actually our planet might become greener if we do not cut the carbon dioxide. So I think it
Yeah.
seems to me we just so how do you think the Supreme Court, and I'll let you go because I know it's getting late here, but how do you think the
Yeah.
Supreme Court is, because I know the DC Court of Appeals, they said that these states don't have standing in this, that
There's
they
no
have to do
standing.
what. So it's ridiculous. So the Supreme Court steps in. What do you think they're going to do? Because they seem to at least indicate that this is clearly a violation of constitutional rights.
Well, the Supreme Court was clearly right to admonish the D.C. court. I mean, and I mean, if you look in court speak, this was kind of a slapdown. I mean, stop acting like juveniles here, and they literally used the term junior varsity,
Yeah,
uh, and talked about error in a way that was pretty sharp because the circuit court here was saying that all these states had no standing to raise any issues. It wasn't clear they could suffer any injury. I mean, how ridiculous is that?
yeah,
First you have this claim that the states have tremendous interest in regulating things even beyond what was in the original law, and then you claim that they don't have any standing. I mean, it doesn't make sense.
no,
So I mean, I'm glad they slapped that down. But the amount that the Supreme Court's going to review now is a narrower one about fuel companies, which of course have a legitimate interest. I do think this Supreme Court has been good at an important thing, asking, does the federal government have the power to do this or not? And I would urge both liberals and conservatives to see this as the right question, because we've got a lot of people who complained during the Biden administration, and some people complained during the early Trump administration. Now we're going to have another Trump administration about what the federal government at the executive level was doing. All that's legitimate criticism in the United States of America because we limit what our government can do and we limit it by laws. And if
mm,
you start to say that laws don't matter, that just whoever you elect can interpret them, well, you're giving away a lot of your rights. And you may think you like it now because you like whoever's in charge, but pretty soon that's going to change.
mm-hmm,
And we've already seen it here now where we had Obama, we had Trump, we had Biden, which kind of, in some respects, echoed a lot of Obama and continued. And now we've got Trump again. It
right.
goes back and forth. And I'm confident here, more confident even than I am that we won't turn into Cuba, Tom,
Oh,
that
that's confidence.
we are going to have future
Yeah,
Republican and Democratic presidents.
yes.
And for that reason, I hope we follow the rule of law.
Yeah, that's such an important point because that pendulum does swing back and forth, and
Yeah.
we've seen it just in the past few years. Well, you're always asking and also answering the right questions. So I very much appreciate your writing about these important issues and coming on the program here to talk about it. Patrick Anderson, the CEO, the founder of Anderson Economic Group. Always a pleasure, Patrick. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
All right, Tom, and you and yours have a great Christmas.
Back at you. Merry Christmas. Thanks so much. Patrick
All right.
Anderson and the whole
Take
team
care.
there at Anderson Economic Group. Hey, let's talk about Jerome Powell, the decision yesterday. The Fed did decide to cut rates, but not as much as some people had hoped for. The Federal Reserve cut its benchmark interest rate by 25 basis points in December, which it is right now, marking the second consecutive cut of that size. Inflation is not down enough yet. It's above the target, and it's even gotten worse over the past couple of months. And so, as I mentioned earlier, I watched some of Jerome Powell's press conference yesterday, and I watched these reporter ask these questions. And listen, I know how reporters think because I was one for many, many, many years, and they were already, trying to get Jerome Powell to blame Donald Trump for the lower than expected rate cut because suddenly the reporters are concerned about Trump causing inflation. So here's one reporter from Reuters asking Jerome Powell a related question. And here's how Jerome Powell responded. Take a look.
The upside risk to inflation jumped quite substantially. The only thing really that's happened, you mentioned that the disinflationary story remains intact, yet the risk weighting has jumped to the upside. The only real thing that's happened is November 5th in the meantime. Is it fair to say that that's what's driving the higher sense of upside risk on inflation?
Actually, that's not the only thing that's happened. What's happened is that our forecasts for inflation for this year, I think, are 5/10 higher than they were in September. So you had 2 months of higher inflation in September and October. As I mentioned, November is back on track. But once again, we've had a year-end projection for inflation, and it's kind of fallen apart as we've approached the end of the year. So that is certainly a large factor in people's thinking. I can tell you that might be the single biggest factor is inflation has once again underperformed relative to expectations. It's still going to be between 2.5 and 3. It's way below where it was, but we really want to see progress on inflation. As I mentioned, as we think about further cuts, we're going to be looking for progress on inflation. We have been moving sideways on 12-month inflation as the 12-month window moves. That's in part because inflation was very, very low measured in the fourth quarter of 2023. Nonetheless, as we go forward, we're going to want to be seeing further progress on bringing inflation down and keeping a solid labor market.
Jerome Powell there answering the reporter's question. But did you see what he did there, the reporter? The reporter asked Powell, don't you think inflation is Donald Trump's fault? And Powell responds, that's not why this is happening. We've had a bad end to this year. Prior to Donald Trump even winning the election in November, inflation is higher than expected. And the reporter asked him, well, the only thing that's happened is November 5th and Donald Trump got elected. And he's like, no, there's been quite a bit that's been going on. If you pay the attention to economic indicators and whatnot, Mr. Reporter from Reuters. And then there's an Associated Press reporter, same thing. They want to blame Donald Trump on what they think is going to be increased inflation. And you contrast this to what was happening in 2021 and 2022 when inflation was going through the roof, directly tied to a lot of these economic policies that were being implemented, billions and billions of dollars of overspending, which was exactly tied with is what causes inflation. And reporters were acting like they didn't know what it was, and they're trying to blame, Donald Trump's handling of COVID for what was happening in real time based on current Joe Biden economic policies. Everybody knows that's how inflation is caused. Anybody who's serious and not disingenuous. So anyway, despite some progress on inflation, the Fed openly admits that its favored inflation gauge, which is the PCE index, remains high, stubbornly high, and they're trying to figure it out. So the economy isn't as stable as officials would like people to believe. That's essentially what Jerome Powell said yesterday. So let's bring in Jimmy Plasky with Executive Wealth Management to weigh in on this. Good to see you, Jimmy. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.
So what do you make of the decision? Do you think it was the right decision to maybe go down a quarter point, not the whole 50 basis points like some people expected, or should he have just kept things status quo, the same for December?
Great question. I absolutely believe that we need to reduce interest rates, that they are high, that as you look at our economy, that you look at inflation, there are some concerns that let's take a step back,
Sure.
right? Let's look at young professionals, millennials per se.
Right.
They've never seen interest rates over 2-3%. Mm-hmm. So there is that cause of concern, right, for people to emotionally get over it. But as an economy, we are still strong, but we're overspending. And you can see that the way the election went, and hopefully some of those policies that could be changed.
Do you think that based on this, that more people are going to start, like we look at various sectors of the economy that depend on lower interest rates. You look at housing, you look at automobiles, automobile loans and whatnot. Do you think credit cards is something else too? And I know we're like historically like far too in debt. Our personal debt in this country, I think, is what over, I forget the $1 trillion mark now that it is, but it's really, really bad. It's never been this high before. But do you think this will help that? Will it reverse not only the debt, but get more people back maybe into the housing market? Maybe more homes will be sold and purchased, and maybe some more automobiles will be purchased as well. Do you think it's going to help those sectors of the economy?
This particular move, yes, right? That when I look at, we'll talk about homes specifically, there's a big emotional barrier for people to get into a home, right? That they have to look at purchasing in the first place, especially for new home buyers and new homeowners, that they are used to hearing their parents talk about 3% interest rates, right? And now that they're at 5-6%, that is a concern, right? Or for me, then they were at 5-6%, but now at 4.25 to 4.5, things become easier. People are able to purchase more and to borrow more. Now, again, is it going to make a difference overnight? No, we all know that.
Yeah.
But as we look at next year, I believe things should get strong. And one thing I do want to state is let's look at 12 months ago. The Fed came out and said, we're not going to cut interest rates in much as 2024 as we initially anticipated in 2023. And the market had a little bit of a pullback. And then we get into 2024 this year, and the S&P's up, 23% this year?
Yeah.
So we have to look at these moments that we hear in the news and understand that it is emotional, right? That you look at the pullback yesterday, the S&P was down 3% after his decision, or the decision came out, forgive me. And this morning, the markets are up, the futures were up, right? So underlying fundamentals, economics, people believe that our country's still strong and working. It's just, can we get there?
Why do you think there is that knee-jerk reaction from the markets when there's something? I mean, to me, this wasn't really an extreme decision. I know they wanted maybe, 0.5%, 50 basis point cut. He got 25 instead. But why the knee-jerk reaction? And then, they come back, they wake up the next morning, come back to reality. Oh, well, maybe it wasn't as bad as we thought. So the markets are this morning doing much better than they were yesterday.
Yes. And it's emotional, right? That's purely what it is people can't borrow money or as much money as they want for as cheap as they want, right? There's an emotional decision of, okay, interest rates aren't dropping. It's still going to be expensive. As you've mentioned, inflation is not where the Fed wants it to be. So that is a little bit of a concern as that starts to straighten out. But I really believe that as this new administration comes in and hopefully they do this Department of Government Efficiency and start to clean up some of that spending, as you mentioned, it can bring down some of those costs that we have as a country and as an economy and put them back into our pockets as, consumers and Americans.
What are some indicators you look at? Like you mentioned the incoming administration and the Department of Government Efficiency. You got Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy trying to do things to make things run more fiscally, conservative, but fiscally efficient. What are some things that you think, if they are able to do, will stimulate the economy and investing and consumer sentiment around the country?
Man, that's a great question and almost a loaded question.
Yeah,
as
it
you
is.
ask.
I know.
But it's all about the dollars, right? Where are those dollars going? And you can go back and look at what's happened in the last, we'll say 6 months in our country, natural disasters, things like that, and how those dollars haven't been put back into our economy and how they need to be. So I believe as we look at our international spending, I believe as we look at the excess spending that we've given out as a country since 2020, as you mentioned, that we're funding multiple sides of multiple wars right now, that has to come home to us. And as we look at that, it is home purchases, it is cars, it is jobs, right? What are those doing right now for us?
Yeah. When you're walking a client through this maze, you don't want them to have that same knee-jerk reaction that Wall Street had yesterday, and then the pendulum swings back today and going back and forth, because that can hurt somebody who's investing for the long term. So how do you walk them through this? And I know you can't give details in terms of specifics of what's going to happen in 2025, but the general flow of the markets over time, how do you walk them through their investment strategies?
Yeah, absolutely. It's cliche as it sounds.
Yeah.
You have to weather the storms, right? And that's both those up and down years. And one thing that I encourage to a lot of my clients is don't look at your portfolio every day, because it's going to drive you insane. Because if you looked at it yesterday at 4 o'clock, you probably weren't very happy. Where if you wait till today at 9:35, you're probably a little bit happier, right? So we have to weather that storm emotionally, and then realize that the decision that the Fed made yesterday does not have an immediate impact on our lives today, right? And maybe a month from now, it might be 2 months from now, right? But that's not going to have an immediate impact on us today. And so again, as that cliche as it sounds, it's weathering that storm, understanding that the news is emotional, that the news isn't always optimistic, right? No offense,
Yeah, no,
right?
no, I'm with you.
But fear sells. Right.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a big thing that we have to look at is, the news is always going to highlight those negative things because people are going to want to look and read about those things.
I tell people, stop watching the news like you do. It's like 24/7 in your feed. I say just watch one program, and that's Tom Jordan Live. It's an hour. It gives you
That's
everything
all you
need to know. And we get great economic advice, too, from guys like Jimmy Plasky with Executive Wealth Management. Go to ewmadvisors.com. A lot of good information. There's news, financial news on there and content that people
Absolutely.
can get stuff. So thanks so much. Good to see you. Jimmy
Thank you for having
Plasky
me.
with Executive Wealth Management. Appreciate it very much. Again, go to ewmadvisors.com. Speaking of things that affect the economy and budgets and all this thing, there might actually be a government shutdown if a spending bill deadline of tomorrow passes without a deal. It's tomorrow night, Friday, 11:59 p.m. If you're going to be up, you can watch it happen. Democrats, they want things like they want a pay raise. They want to hide emails from members of Congress. No transparency, and they're sneaking these things through this stuff. It's a big omnibus package, and they want to shield members of the January 6th Select Committee from review. Like you can't review how they came to their decisions. And it would spend millions of dollars on censoring speech and a whole lot more. So incoming White House Deputy Chief of Policy Stephen Miller reacted to House Republicans' stopgap funding bill and had an interesting exchange yesterday with Sean Hannity on Fox News. Take a look.
Here's what it comes down to. First and foremost, Donald Trump just won a historic landslide. He is entitled to come into office in January and work on his agenda the American people elected him to. He should not have to come into office and immediately be saddled with a government funding expiration followed by a debt ceiling expiration. That is what the current plan would do, is he would come into office and immediately have to work on negotiating a debt ceiling hike with Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries and extension of government funding. That is not consistent with putting Donald Trump in the best possible position to enact the transformative legislative agenda that he campaigned on. Historic tax cuts and reforms, an energy revolution, record-setting border security and border protection investments, and the entire agenda to bust inflation and make this economy grow. Furthermore, as you've mentioned, there are provisions that are in this year-end government funding bill that are on their face unacceptable. How are we even having a conversation about a provision that would shield members of the January 6th Unselect Committee from basic oversight, accountability, and investigation? How are we talking about funding global censorship at the State Department? And again, how are we talking about sticking President Trump with a debt ceiling expiration at the very beginning of his administration? Set President Trump up for success, set him up to put the agenda he campaigned on into action.
Yeah, and stop kicking that can down the road. I mean, March was what they were going to, kick this down into. And it's like, no, deal with it now. And that's what Donald Trump did. The president-elect, he was urging Republicans to block the massive stopgap funding bill, which was championed by House Speaker Mike Johnson. This government shutdown looms. But this whole package, essentially, Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy came out and said, we can do this in one page. Instead, you know how big it was? It was 1,547 pages, the spending bill. And it was designed to fund the government through March 14th. But rightfully so, a lot of fierce grassroots backlash, amplified by Elon Musk's criticism on X, and then Donald Trump's late night intervention. It's good that he did. I mean, listen, they want to do things. They want to streamline the bill. Donald Trump wants to fund what needs to be funded. And he wants to include aid for farmers and disaster victims. But rejecting all these legislative add-ons that conservatives are arguing are just totally wasteful. I mean, it's completely unpopular with the vast majority of Americans and also among the rank and file Republicans. And then Vice President-elect J.D. Vance, he came out and publicly opposed this, and finally forced Johnson to pull the measure to avoid its defeat because they're losing votes. They're bleeding votes on this. And the timing is no accident. I mean, with the January 3rd, House Speaker vote fast approaching, and Johnson was going to get a lot of pushback on this. And Kevin McCarthy, we don't want to repeat what happened with Kevin McCarthy because he did the same thing. He was allowing these massive spending bills to go forward with a majority. So Johnson did mounting pressure to appease this divided GOP caucus, and his attempt to salvage support by adding agricultural aid, it backfired. It's a fragile balance that he's got to strike in the new Congress. Put the aid up for a single vote. Don't tuck it into a bill that has all this pork in it in order to gain leverage. And listen, Donald Trump, what he did yesterday, it's similar to what he did in 2019 when there was this whole threat of a shutdown. And again, the deadline to avert a shutdown is 11:59 p.m. Friday. Here's the deal on this, is that House Speaker Mike Johnson, he promised a straightforward stopgap measure. He could have done it in a page, and instead it was more than 1,500 pages. It's a monstrosity, riddled with all these backroom deals and pork as a result of those backroom deals. And conservatives did expect fiscal discipline, not this bloated giveaway that is effectively mirroring the very spending sprees that they campaigned against. Pay raises for Congress? No. In a time of record inflation, rising household costs, and these members of Congress making millions, many of them, because somehow they get a heads up on which, stocks are going to do well in the near future. So doing quite well in terms of their wealth already. They're going to ask for a 3.8 pay raise. I think it came out to, I don't know, someone says $65,000 increase. It's a slap in the face to struggling Americans. And while the average family is trying to tighten its belt, Congress wants to pad its wallet. Totally out of touch. It doesn't even begin to describe it. Allowing Congress to opt out of Obamacare is total hypocrisy. They're the ones that implemented Obamacare, saying the reason for it is it was better health care for Americans, but they get to opt out of it. Why would they want to do something if it's better? Why would they want to do that? It allows lawmakers to dodge Obamacare in favor of these nice Cadillac-style health plans, and those very same politicians who forced the failing, Obamacare is a failing system on the American people, now want a taxpayer-funded escape route for themselves. That's totally a double standard. It's indefensible. The debt ceiling denial will haunt Republicans. I was back and forth on this whole issue of the debt ceiling, raising it, but Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, they're insisting on addressing the debt ceiling now rather than later. And when you look at the reasons why, it is prudent to do it this way because it's a ticking time bomb if you don't. And they would have to address it in January, right when Donald Trump takes office. And it would undermine, Stephen Miller was right here, any legislative agenda, and it would, rattle the financial markets then. And then you kick the can down the road. I mean, it's this constant thing we do every single year. Last year they said it'd be the last time they do it. The year prior to that, the same thing. Yet they keep doing it. So the farmers, the disaster victims, they deserve better. So attaching what's necessary, the necessary aid for farmers and disaster relief, attaching that to a pork-laden spending bill, it actually weaponizes their plight, their situation, for political leverage. And conservatives should demand, and they are now demanding, standalone funding that directly addresses those urgent needs without unnecessary baggage. Call the Democrats' bluff on a shutdown. I'm all for it. Listen, when I heard Newt Gingrich yesterday talk about this, and people praised Newt Gingrich for the balanced budget while he was the Speaker of the House and Congress, and how did he do that? He's like, I shut down the government. It's a tool to get people to jump on board of stopping their reckless spending. If you're not going to stop all this reckless spending, then we're not going to give you any more money to do that. So we're going to shut down the government. And, the liberals out there are, crying, oh my goodness, it's not really that big of a deal if you shut down the government. You know that? We don't hear people crying and wailing when, Ford and General Motors and Stellantis, they do what they call, they shut down their operations for a while. They call them layoffs. They're very temporary layoffs, but that's what they call them. You don't hear the auto manufacturers crumble. No, because it's necessary to do it to streamline their spending. And so Donald Trump is saying, "Listen, I'll call your bluff here. We'll shut down the government." The Republicans had to hold firm at this point, call the bluff, and expose the Democrats as the true obstructionist when they refuse to prioritize essential funding. No longer pay attention to what you're hearing from MSNBC and the Rachel Maddows and the Joy Reids of the world, or the guys and gals from CNN. Don't pay attention to that. It's just rhetoric, and it's an intimidating factor, a manipulation to get you to do what they want and to once again acquiesce to all this pork that's going to keep inflation on the rise because you're going to be overspending, and that directly affects American consumers and people just trying to squeak by, eke out a living on a month-to-month basis. So I'm liking that. I think Donald Trump seems to be the president right now, doesn't he? Where's Joe Biden and all this? Haven't seen much of him lately. All right, got a couple comments here. Let's bring them up one by one. Got just barely enough time for them, so thanks for your patience. The engineer, have you ever noticed that leftists only offer two ways to get people to follow them? One, fear-mongering. Absolutely. Two, at the end of a gun barrel, COVID, climate change, they never offer a better alternative. Couldn't have said it better myself, the engineer. Always spot on. Appreciate that. Yeah, it's fear-mongering at its best. And he's talking about the New York Times right now, fear-mongering that if the government does not mandate subsidies to prop up the electric vehicle industry when they're still only selling 8%, I think is what it is, and they want it to be 53% by 2030 or 2027. It's not going to happen unless it's forced. And now the New York Times is recommending forced adherence to these mandated EPA regulations. So you will have to no longer buy electric vehicle. And if you don't do it, you're going to end up like Cuba. I don't think Tom Friedman, who wrote this in the New York Times, truly believes this. I really don't. Because I think he's smarter than that. I think he understands that Cuba is a communist country. That's why they're driving old vehicles. The United States, what he's advocating for actually is communism. He wants us to be like China because they're doing it right, because they have very nice trains. Have you noticed in China? So we need to do what they do to also have nice trains. No, you don't want to be like China. I guarantee it. My Chinese friends will tell you they left that country for a reason. They fled for their safety and for their lives. All right, thanks. Engineer, always good. Let's bring up one more here. It is Jim Chikowski is back. Hey, Jim, how are you? Ronald Reagan wanted line item veto. It's time to get that done. Absolutely. Line by line by line. Go through it, do the work. It might take you to Christmas Eve to get it done. But I'm telling you, if you're going to kick this can down the road again and put everything and lump everything in one basket, and you got to vote on everything when the vast majority of it it's reckless, it's pork, and it's going to lead to inflation once again. And you're going against the promises, why you were elected as a majority Republicans. So good. Mike Johnson backtrack. He listened to Donald Trump and the president-elect. He's not even in office yet. He's already doing some good work. So, yeah, right. Line by line vetoes and decision-making and standalone bills when you're dealing with farmers and disaster aid and disaster relief. They don't need to be lumped into an omnibus package that will only hurt a wide majority of the people in this country. Thanks so much for being a part of our program today on Tom Jordan Live. Reminder, it's on YouTube, Facebook, X, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Go to TomJordanLive.com. You can learn more about the program. And if you'd like to help us out financially, go to Patreon.com and look for Tom Jordan Live. Thank you so much. God bless you. We'll see you back here tomorrow.